The Alien Inside. By Amy Ireland. Here is the blueprint for ingress. Virginia Barron. Cryptocrystalline. Paranoia and narcissism are modalities of control disguised as means to evade control. The first is a relation to the world, the second a relation to the self. In isolation, the effects of paranoia and narcissism are inconvenient yet essentially limited in scope, entangled with one another. However, they enter a relationship of mutual excitation, resulting in a complex that crosses a threshold of destructive potential, tending towards the catastrophic. If anyone understood the strange dynamic at stake in this state of affairs, it was science fiction writer Philip K. Dick, who explored it at multiple levels of instantiation. It is staged at the level of the family in The Father Thing, which tells of a child's realization that his father has been replaced by an exact copy, and the ensuing struggle to convince his incredulous mother of the switch, at the level of The City in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. Later adapted into the film Blade Runner, in which bounty hunter Rick Deckard takes a contract to retire 6 escaped androids, whose essential difference from the humans they are designed to aid is impossible to determine without a complex psychological test. Then there is the level of the Earth in Second Variety, in which a group of soldiers discovers that the United Nations fully autonomous, cell-replicating weapons system has learned to upgrade itself to 3 varieties of humanoid units, only 2 of which the soldiers have identified, leaving them to wonder who among them might in fact be a deadly avatar of the unknown second variety. And, finally, we see the dynamic playing out at the level of the solar system in Imposter. The story of Spence Olam, a hapless military employee who has unknowingly been replaced by an alien replica equipped with Olam's memories and a deadly internal bomb, part of an Alpha Dentorian plot to circumvent humanity's defense systems. Despite incontrovertible intel to the contrary, Olam engages in increasingly futile attempts to prove his humanity to those who have been ordered to kill him. These stories have a consistent logic. A homogeneous community discovers it has been infiltrated by inhuman others, fungal simulacra, artificially intelligent androids, sentient weaponry and aliens, respectively, whose power and menace, even when the entities in question are not explicitly malevolent, reside in their indistinguishability from human beings. The community can no longer identify itself by means of a negative other, that which it can obviously exclude, and so the problem of identification rapidly escalates into a paranoid nightmare of cascading denunciations that destabilize social integrity, gnawing at the group from within and ultimately causing it to self-destruct. The territory these narratives put into question is the impermeable, unsimulatable, authentic and original subject of a spontaneous, paranoid humanism, a humanism, whether indexed by the reflexive loop of reason or the recognition of the ego as it cites itself for the first time in the psychoanalytical mirror, that is profoundly narcissistic. Subjected to the laws of a system that derives its representational coordinates from primary similarity, anything that is not identical or negatable in a predictable manner is fundamentally imperceptible. It is this imperceptibility that furnishes the pessimism leveraged by Dick in his stories. The true nature of the interloper is only able to be grasped, usually by means of a test, after the catastrophic threshold has been crossed. Computer scientist and astronomer Jacques Vallée, a shrewd thinker of control dynamics who has written a series of measured and methodologically scrupulous books on the UFO phenomenon, managing, admirably, to scandalize contemporary rationalist and ufology communities alike, traces cultural evidence of interloper paranoia at least as far back as medieval times. In Passport to Magenta, he presents his evidence in a series of case studies, examining the stories of abduction, miscegenation and infiltration that pervade, of all things, fairy lore. There are numerous stories in folklore of humans who have gone to fairyland of their own will, but we also have numerous accounts of abductions by the fairies. They take men and women, especially pregnant women or young mothers, and they are very active in stealing young children. Sometimes, they substitute a false child for the real one. leaving in place of the real child a broom with rugs wrapped around it or one of their children, a changeling. Valley's idiosyncrasy, from the viewpoint of those who believe in the specifically modern character of alien visitation, is his insistence that evidence of the phenomenon is detectable in the mythologies of geographically and historically distinct cultural groups. Once stripped back to their structural components, kidnapping, abduction, replacement of an individual by a disguised outsider, attempts at impregnation or genetic extraction, often in a context of community fragility or ideological turmoil, these narratives of infiltration are tellingly isomorphic with 20th-century accounts of the UFO phenomenon. Rather than taking this as proof of extraterrestrial intervention across time, Valley approaches the issue negatively, as the reverse image of a persistent cultural imaginary, which, far from telling us anything about alien technology or communication, offers insight into the complex workings of our own cultural semiotic systems. Continuing his comparison with the changeling mythos, he writes, "Of course, the UFO myth has not yet reached such romantic proportions, but we are perhaps not quite far from it. At least in certain rural areas, where strange flying objects have become a source of terror to people traveling at night, and where the rumor that invaders might be around has gained interest, if not support." A recent television series has capitalized on this aspect of UFO lore. In the show, the human race has been infiltrated by extraterrestrials who differ from humans in small details only. This is not a new idea, as the belief in changelings shows. And there is a well-known passage in Martin Luther's Table Talk, in which he tells the Prince of Anhalt that he should throw into the Moldau a certain man who is, in his opinion, such a changeling, or Killkrop, as they were called in Germany. It doesn't take much to extend the continuum Valley draws between folklore, myth and the UFO phenomenon to the replicants, clones and anthropopathogenic parasites that permeate contemporary science fiction. This fear of the alien insider has been with humanity for far longer than we might assume, and its specific brand of horror is connected to an intense doubt concerning the stability of our imputed humanness. How do we know what we are when other beings can fool us so profoundly? Worse, how can we be sure that, unlike Rachel Rosen in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Or Spence Solomon Imposter, we aren't one of them? A security function is inevitably triggered and endorsed by us, the faithful adherents of the religious institutions that have made it their job to purge villages of interlopers and will, so we persistently imagine, relieve our future cities of inhuman intruders. The guiding effect is distrust. And distrust reaches its peak when it is no longer simply directed at the other, the alien, the supernatural, the machinic, but turns upon itself. We are so paranoid because we know there is nothing on which to hang an enduring notion of the human that cannot also be perfectly simulated. Western monotheism, following a similar impulse, makes absolute and anthropomorphizes its God. Once this move has been made, all evil can be understood as essentially separate, inhuman, when held against a humanized image of God, and consequently available for exorcism. Changelings and Killkrops are laid in the place of legitimate children by Satan in order to plague mankind, states Luther. In the passage mentioned by Valley above, such a changeling child is only a piece of flesh, a mascarnus, because it has no soul. The remedy hardly needs reiterating, that is not your child. It is the devil. Throw him into the brook. Occultist, theosophist and consummate religious hoaxer Helena Petrovna Blavatsky explains it in the following way. Satan never assumed an anthropomorphic, individualized shape until the creation by man of a one living personal God had been accomplished, and then merely as a matter of prime necessity. A screen was needed, a scapegoat to explain the cruelty, blunders, and all but too evident injustice, perpetrated by him for whom absolute perfection, mercy, and goodness were claimed. Again, we encounter a familiar logic. Rigidly enforced identity generates an illusory, externalized negative, fooling its bearer into believing that circumscribing an antagonist supplies the power to eliminate it. It is this narcissistic fervor for purification that conceals the fact that the alien is already inside, and always has been. Hygiene is its camouflage, and its weapon. The terminal stage of the paranoia narcissism circuit is reached when the relation to self that characterizes narcissism becomes the logic for the relation to the world, and the relation to the world that characterizes paranoia becomes the logic for the relation to self. Identity is easy. It is much simpler to grasp oneself as an integral whole than it is to understand, with Blavatsky, in her wildest moments of esoteric pastiche, that one is a perpetually shifting assemblage caught in a process of continuous becoming that comprehends individuation only as estrangement. The self, in its broadest delineation, is an unhappy state of material and conceptual petrification, the fate of which is to be dissolved in the deeper currents of cosmic ebb and flow. But one does not need to take Blavatsky at her word to draw out the important structural implications of this thought of dissolution. The priority of non-identity is itself an alien insider, ironically installed by the very program that attempts most vociferously to excise it, Enlightenment humanism. You are not what you think you are. The seed of this sci-fi horror story lies in the writings of Enlightenment boss Immanuel Kant, who, in his recalibration of philosophy to account for the conditions of the possibility of experience, shifted the border separating insider from outsider, self and other, inside the limit of human experience. In the Kantian account, consciousness is a complex of a priori and synthetic functions. The former provides the contentless rules by which all experience is composed, and the latter plugs them into the raw data of empirical sensibility. Most significantly, everything that appears to us, including our consciousness of self, appears in time. It is impossible to have a non-chronological experience. Chronological conditioning pre-exists and determines the ego's apprehension of itself. We have zero control over it and, separated from it by an infranable lag, we are fundamentally barred from grasping this part of ourselves that gives us our experience of self in itself. While this suturing of a priori formalism to the synthesis of empirical experience affords a non-theological account of the universality of human experience, the fact that we all experience phenomena in a way that is intelligible across independent subjectivities, it also effectively splits the supposed integrality of the cognitive I in two: on one hand, an imperceptible thing that thinks, on the other, a thing that has the experience of the thoughts thought by the thing that thinks. Each human subjective experience is understood as carrying an irreducible exteriority at its heart, an obscure motor that processes all experience, determining yet indeterminable, the immanent abstraction of temporal succession grasped as a personal, yet universal, alien interloper. From Kant onwards, the self-other distinction becomes infinitely more difficult to police because, as Gilles Deleuze has pointed out, applying Arthur Rimbaud's formula to the consequences of Kantian critique, I is another. The sublimation of the all-too-intimate horror of the alien insider into a generalized paranoia of outsider infiltration, with its various forms of identity validation and border control, is understandable, abstractly, as a response to the inadmissible possibility that alienation is intrinsic to our condition as subjects of experience. Drawing on the work of Deleuze and her co-conspirators in the experimental art and philosophy collective known as CCRU, Anna Greenspan has put it thus: for Kant there is no security in self-consciousness. It is nothing but a mask. Like the replicants in the film Blade Runner, transcendental philosophy torments the subject with the refrain "You are not what you think you are." The model of all anti-territories, the other of the self-other dyad, is transcendental time. What are we but a complex set of syntheses temporarily assembled behind a sufficiently elaborate human mask? Our problem is not the externalized difference of the inhuman outsider, the dissimulating alien, the duplicitous fairy, the illegal immigrant, the all-too-human machine, whatever name one gives it. It wants nothing more than for you to name it. It is our inability to grasp the illusion of integrality in the first place. If we refuse to rid ourselves of the narcissistic compulsion to draw the contours of difference from an illusory model of identity and, correspondingly, to fear difference, a construction roughly equating intrinsic humanity could indeed be thrown up. To be a human is to desire oneself, etched along the whirling blades of infinite transmutation.